Welcome back to part 2 of our lecture on the July days. You can see on the notes that we're all the way down now on page 2 and up to this heading here that says Impact of the July days on the Bolsheviks. What we've been talking about is we've gone over the events of the July days and the fact that we saw massive protests, particularly built by soldiers and sailors deserting from the front lines, but joined by the workers, and how Kerensky had to brutally put those down. He did have some loyal troops left who were able to disperse the crowds and bring some control back to Petrograd. Kerensky blamed the Bolsheviks for what had happened, even though we know that the Bolshevik party led by Lenin had actually pulled back from going ahead with a revolution at that point in time. It was Bolshevik ideas that had driven those more radical soldiers and sailors and workers in order to, go ahead with their revolutionary ideas. And Kerensky firmly places the blame on the Bolsheviks. Many of the banners that had been involved in the protests had actually carried Bolshevik-type slogans, all power to the Soviets, peace, bread, land. And some Bolsheviks in the party, despite Lenin's warnings and concerns, had gotten involved. They thought that the revolution had come. They thought that time had come. And we do see them, some of them out on the streets as part of the July days unrest. Kerensky saw this as an opportunity to bring the Bolsheviks down. He didn't necessarily want to bring all of the socialists down. Remember, he is a socialist revolutionary and remained a member of the Soviet at this point. But the Bolsheviks were radical. The Bolsheviks were in the minority, remember, but were causing problems. And so he wanted to bring them down and diminish their power. So new rules are implemented. There is now a ban on processions and demonstrations to make sure that the protesters are not allowed on the streets. And there is a ban on any publications which have anti-government ideas. We're moving away now from the freedoms that the initial provisional government implemented. Kerensky sees the problems, and so they start to crack down. Newspapers also were told that they had to publish articles saying how Lenin and the Bolsheviks were German spies, that they were receiving payments from the German government in order to deliberately create unrest. Now, there's some speculation. There may well have been some truth to this. Certainly, the Germans had been very happy to put Lenin on a sealed train, and there is some evidence that Lenin was receiving some payments from the Germans in order to help create further unrest in Russia. The Germans, of course, hoping that Russia would withdraw from the war and close the Eastern Front. Also, Kerensky orders that key Bolsheviks are arrested. So the Bolshevik hiding places are raided. The offices of their newspaper, Pravda, are destroyed. And we see some of the key Bolsheviks arrested, thrown into prison. Kollontai and Stalin, for example, are now thrown into prison. We've got diaries from Kollontai talking about the despair that she felt at this point in time in prison. In fact, Kollontai hadn't been there during the July days. She'd been out of Russia in Stockholm on Bolshevik business. She rushed back in order to provide support to her party and, of course, was promptly arrested and thrown in jail. Now, what happens to Lenin? Lenin escapes. You can see here a very different looking Lenin. This is Lenin in disguise, beard gone, some fake hair put on place. And so he escapes out of Petrograd together with Zinoviev. They escape into Finland. Finland was, of course, still part of the Russian Empire at that stage, but was distant enough where they could go into hiding. They spend a number of months hiding in a hayloft amongst the hay, continuing to write when they could, sending messages back to the other Bolsheviks still in Petrograd. But certainly Lenin, at this point, is thinking the revolution has been lost. It's over. It's gone. And we've got here Sheila Fitzpatrick, a well-known writer on Russia and what Russia was like during the revolution and during Soviet times. And she's described the July days as having damaged Bolshevik morale and Lenin's credibility as a revolutionary leader. This is a low point for the Bolshevik Party, and it looks like they really are going to be in problems. How, with their leaders dispersed or in jail, how are they going to regain the momentum they seem to be getting up to this point? And certainly many of them felt that the revolution was over, that their time had been missed. Trotsky, remember, being a Menshevik, had also been arrested and thrown into prison in the wake of the July days. Kerensky certainly understood that Trotsky felt the same way as Lenin, and even though he wasn't a Bolshevik, was seen as a threat to the provisional government and was arrested. And it's during this time in prison that Trotsky actually makes the official shift and becomes a member of the Bolshevik Party. From this point forward, we see much closer cooperation between Trotsky and Lenin. So even at this point they're in different places, we see a lot more correspondence and a joining of forces, a joining of their minds to work towards the Bolshevik ideals. But it's not just the Bolsheviks that have been damaged. The provisional government is really unbalanced and having problems. Prince Lvov, remember, our fairly ineffective leader of the provisional government, resigns. And Kerensky is the man. He's seen to be the one who was able to take the action as Minister of War. He took action during the July days and saved the provisional government in Petrograd. And so Alexander Kerensky is now not only the Minister for War, but he becomes the new Prime Minister. And he becomes the hero of the provisional government. And they pin all of their hopes on him, able to establish control and run the government effectively. So it's interesting to see that the provisional government is now being run by a socialist. However, Kerensky's loyalties now lie with the provisional government and their ideas. He is still a socialist, but he now takes his responsibility as the Prime Minister of the provisional government very seriously. And what we have to see now is whether or not he actually can save the provisional government as 1917 continues. And that's it for our lecture on the July days. We need to move to the next series of lectures on the Kornilov affair to see what happens next.